And hello everyone, welcome back to another CSS tutorial. So in this tutorial we'll be talking about units. So let's say we want to set the width of something, then we can use units to set the width. For example, here we have, let's say, 16 pixels of margin, right? So here, that's 16 pixels. Now I could also go 1 rem. 1 rem is about equivalent to 16 pixels, or 1 em. Very similar to rem, but not quite the same. There are a lot of these like measurements. We can even go centimeters. For example, I think that's about 1 centimeter. Actually, it's less. So we can even go things like centimeters. I'm gonna, can we go meter? Probably not. You can go millimeter though. Anyhow, the point is, there's a lot of measurement units that we can use, such as pixels, em, rem, centimeters, millimeters, and I believe it's about time we cover them. Now, let's start from the top. First of all, we get millimeters. I believe most of us know about that. We get centimeters. Most of us know about centimeters. For those of you who lives in the Americas, you have inches. You also get PT for points. And you get PC. Most of these are kind of irrelevant. It's very dependent on what you prefer. You can go search up what you prefer most. And then you have things like PX. Now, PX is very special. Pixels will change depending on the device viewing it. For example, let's say you have a TV. A 1 pixel on a TV might be bigger than 1 pixel on a monitor. So generally it is discouraged to work with pixels because of this. Because just because something looks good on your screen, if you're using pixels, the chances are it might not look good on a different screen because pixels do not scale well. That is why in general, we all always recommend that you use EM or rem. There are other measurements and stuff you can use, but generally I prefer rem. And you have your own things you can prefer. Some relative lengths that we would recommend is like, let's start with EM. So you have like EM, and this is relative to the font size of the element. So 2 EM will be 2 times the font size of the element. So if I go here and I say font size should be 20 pixels. And then here we go 2 EM. Now that will be about 40 pixels. So if we go 40 pixels, you won't see a difference. So EM is relative to the font size of the element. Meaning if I say font size is 1, or that's 10, but if I say 1, you'll see it also decreases. Now pixels as well, they can also use rem. So for example, 1 rem as an example, or 1 EM is a little bit weird, but yeah, 1 rem would be good as well. And we'll get to rem in a second. Now as for rem sets the relative font size of the root element. In a sense, it takes the browser's default font size you could think of. Meaning rem will rarely ever change, and it will scale nicely depending on the screen because of how font sizes work. So it depends on what you prefer. I prefer rem over EM just because rem has a smaller chance of ever changing, where with EM, that will change depending on the font size of the current element. It's depending on what you prefer, but I prefer rem. But you also have other things, such as, let's go here and say EX. So this is relative to the X height of the current font. Very rarely used. And then you have things like CH, which is relative to the width of the 0 character. So relative to the width of this thing, 0. Again, that's kind of on what you prefer. Something I see a lot is vertical width. So this will give you basically one vertical width is 1% of this width here. Meaning, if I make my browser any longer, you'll notice this top part here, it grows. So here it is just about as big as my cursor. Now if I were to go like this, you'll see it gets bigger. So VW means vertical width. So 2 vertical width is 2% of the vertical width here. So 100 would be, of course, this entire vertical width like this. And if you flip it, you'll get that. The same can be good for vertical height. So now it will be one page height. If we go 10, then it will be 10% basically of the page height. I do see these used quite often, but it's up to you which you prefer. You also get things like vmin, vmax, and then finally you get percentage, which is what I prefer. So for example, 10%. And those are a few units you might want to know about. Primarily, if you're just getting started with CSS, you can actually just stick with pixels if you find that fairly simple. Otherwise, I recommend rem. You can think of rem as 16 pixels is about equal to 1 rem. And rem rarely ever changes, so I would always recommend staying with that. But EM is also a favorite of a lot of people, so you might want to go for EM instead, depending on which you prefer. Again, it generally doesn't matter which you use. Just keep in mind that some links may change depending on like the person's screen size and pixel density and whatnot. Thank you for watching. I hope you all enjoyed, and I will see you all again in the next CSS tutorial.